Amid a buzz of activity outside the Boulder County Justice Center, people jockeyed for parking space amid tangled traffic and tight security. With the media circus tailing them, the 12 Boulder County residents who make up the JonBeney Ramsey grand jury arrived early morning to do their civic duty.
After showing an image from an air taser or the box of an air taser and playing a clip of Lou Smith's voice, we see the grand jurors for the first time. This is actually quite a subtle form of mindfuckery. It's almost like Lou Smith's evidence is why the grand jury comes about. Now, it's September 15, 1998. It's not 1 year and 8 months after the murder, but a year and 9 3/4 months, almost a year and 10 months after the incident. Netflix can't get simple details like counting the number of months right, well, what else can you expect from them? Now, the more pertinent point is that it took another 3.5 months after the police's 2-day presentation to initiate a grand jury investigation.
When the grand jury was in process, we fully expected and were prepared to be indicted.
That's interesting, the "we were prepared" part, because his lawyers seemed prepared, didn't they? And the DA seemed to have his plan B locked and loaded, didn't he? But John's right. They were right to expect to be indicted because that's exactly what the grand jury did vote to do. And correct me if I'm wrong, although Netflix were capable of providing a lot of detail when they wanted to, did they provide any detail on the indictments? On these indictments John's referring to, did they spend much time on it? Did Netflix, for example, go into this sort of detail?
17 years after JonBenet's murder, the court released 4 true bills or written decisions from the grand jury. The jury recommended indicting John and Patsy Ramsey for child abuse resulting in death and accessory to first-degree murder.
There is insufficient evidence to bring charges at this time.
But Alex Hunter, the DA at the time, declined to prosecute the Ramseys. Hunter would not return our calls.
2 charges apiece for John Ramsey and Patsy Ramsey. Now, one way you could deal with that is you could look at those charges, each one individually for John, and then the other one for John, then one of them to Patsy, and then the other one. And then think about, what are we actually talking about here? And that is how you could deal with them in some detail. And you could also have John responding to these charges on camera. Does that happen? Incidentally, it's legally incorrect to say the Ramseys were indicted by the grand jury. The grand jury voted to indict, but those indictments had to be ratified, signed off, signed into law in order to become official documents, to become actual indictments. If you've never heard this little disclaimer, this sort of technical aspect to what we're dealing with here, it's because it almost never happens.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Now, first of all, it's surprising to me to see John casually talking about the grand jury trial in late 2024, especially if you look at some of his other statements and you read their book, The Death of Innocence. We're going to get to that in a moment. Because John simply hasn't been this casual about it all along. Do you remember this moment, this question from a CNN reporter in 2016 on the 20-year anniversary 8 years ago?
John Ramsey, although well aware of the grand jury's decision, has his own opinion.
What we were indicted for, which was nonsense, was child abuse resulting in death. And we were told, well, you didn't protect your child. And that's true.
What about accessory? They also voted to indict on accessory.
Really? I didn't know that. I don't know even what that means, frankly.
Meaning that you and Patsy helped someone else.
Really? Well, that's absurd.
Do you notice the humongous grin on John's face when he says that? And what do you think, is there anyone in the true crime community that doesn't know what an accessory is? Do you think that John Ramsey doesn't know what an accessory is? I mean, it's something that has been mentioned in the media, and it's something that has to do with him And do you think that he doesn't know about it? I mean, hasn't he spoken to people like Lou Smith and John Douglas? Has he never ever heard the term accessory? Does he really not know what it means? And also, did he really not know about it in 2020? Remember, the indictments were released, or the voting to indict were released in 2013. This interview is from 3 years later. And so here you've actually got the interviewer actually explaining to him on camera what accessory means, and that this was what the grand jury voted because John apparently didn't know. How kind of believable do you think that is?
That you and Patsy helped someone else.
Really? Well, that's absurd. It's just absurd.
There are those who speculate that someone else was Burke, JonBenet's big brother.
More typically, though, John Ramsey's stock answer when dealing with the damaging, very underestimated and very often very glossed over part of the Ramsey narrative is to say something that is generally true.
Because the saying is you can indict a ham sandwich in front of a grand jury. It's a one-sided argument.
That's interesting, the one-sided argument postscript in this little snippet. Given how the grand jury decision ultimately ended up being so unfairly one-sided and hidden from the media and the public, well, everyone. And then we see vintage footage of arch Ramsey apologist Paula Woodward. Of late, Woodward literally appears side by side with John Ramsey at CrimeCon. I believe she's done so at the last 3 CrimeCons in a row. It's almost like she's his sidekick. But here she is back in the day educating the layman on how grand jury trials work.
In a regular criminal trial, you have your 12 jurors here, and then you have 2 tables, one for the defense, one for the prosecution. But in a grand jury, it's different. There is no defense.
Oh my God, what? Are you saying the Ramseys were tried by a grand jury purely based on the prosecution's case? Jeepers, that changes everything.
The goal was to get an indictment for murder. Don't worry about any counter thoughts or defense.
It almost looks like John was going to say counter arguments, and then he changed his mind and said counter thoughts. If I was John and I was falsely indicted, or someone voted to indict me and my partner as well, I think I'd be aggrieved, wouldn't you? If you were falsely indicted and maybe you came out of it many years later, would you be smiling about it afterwards? I mean, just look at this huge smile on his face as he describes this. And you really want to carefully watch the clip, sort of slow it down, look at it a few times, because John's body language is a sort of wink-wink, conspirational tone to it, doesn't it? Or am I reading it wrong? You know, the way he nods his head and leans over with a small little grin on his face. It's quite interesting, isn't it? If you ask me, he looks delighted as he deals with the subject, just as he looked delighted when he's got this big open mouth. He even sort of tilts his head back when he's speaking to that interview on CNN on the same topic. He seems delighted rather than aggrieved, as one might expect. And how often does he talk about just how badly they've been treated? And here you are being treated by suspects by the grand jury, and it seems to be a big joke. In this analysis, I want to challenge what you know and what you think you know about grand jury trials, but more pertinently, what you thought you knew for sure about the grand jury trial in the JonBeney Ramsey case. But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. Okay, so in our effort to dismantle the counter-narrative in terms of the grand jury, where do we start? Well, as a simple introduction to this important subject, allow me to plant a seed. If the grand jury trial is just the prosecution presenting their side, it's just that one side. It is, isn't it? And if it's so easy that you could indict a ham sandwich, and it is, isn't it? Well, what is wrong with this picture?
After more than a year of looking over evidence and hearing testimony, the grand jury has now made its decision.
Sorry, what was that?
After more than a year of looking over evidence...
Hold on, did she say more than a year of looking at evidence? Are you saying the prosecution only presented their case and it took more than a year for them to do that, and that it was so simple? If it's so simple, why does John bring up the ham sandwich story? I mean, he brought it up at CrimeCon in Nashville just a few months ago as well. Listen to this.
Let's talk about the grand jury. In 1998, the then district attorney in Boulder started a grand jury. And the focus of it was whether or not the Ramsey case and whether or not there was enough evidence to go to trial.
Now, even that retelling of the story is quite interesting for what it leaves out. But is Paula Woodward right when she says that the purpose of the grand jury trial is to see if there's enough evidence? It's almost like she's putting the starting line right next to the finishing line, which is Alex Hunter says there's insufficient evidence, and then Paula says, well, you know what they need to do is look at whether there is enough evidence. And so obviously you'd say, no, well, there wasn't enough evidence. But is that what the grand jury is supposed to do? And I thought it's about that you can indict a ham sandwich even with no evidence. And so what is this deal about it taking more than a year to hear all the evidence? And part of what we are dealing with here is somewhat true, which is that you don't need a lot of evidence and that you can actually indict on a much lower standard, which is probable cause.
And, grand juries, you've heard the saying, I'm sure you can convict a ham sandwich in a grand jury. They're a one-sided presentation by the prosecutor in hopes of getting an indictment recommendation from the grand jury. And that's the whole objective of a grand jury. It's not really an investigative jury or like a trial jury.
Now, what John says there, again, almost a sort of postscript where he says it's not like an investigative jury. Well, we need to really highlight that, and we need to keep that in the back of our minds because we are going to come back to that.
It's not really an investigative jury.
Now, let's go to an excerpt from The Death of Innocence written by John and Patsy Ramsey. After 13 long months of looking at all the evidence presented by the special prosecutors and police, the Boulder grand jury said no to an indictment. Really? Did they? It takes a mountain of evidence to convict, but only a paltry amount of evidence to indict. Yet in the eyes of the grand jurors, even that did not exist. Really? Nor was there anything in our backgrounds that would indicate even the slightest potential for such a horrendous crime. Well, there is some truth to that, but what we should do is look at what the grand jury looked at, which witnesses spoke about backgrounds, and what did the grand jury make of that evidence. And we're going to touch on that lightly in a moment. Now, before we leave this excerpt, and it would be easy to miss this if we did, under that paragraph, it begins, of course, in the months that followed the grand jury's secret decision, there was much speculation by the media on what the grand jury really did conclude. To suggest that it voted to indict, oh no, wow, they voted to indict? And that the DA refused to go along, as some of the media speculated, oh, the horrible media, they lie all the time, they lie, is pure folly. If that had been the case, the police would certainly have leaked it to the media before the grand jurors even arrived home. Seems like someone is counting on someone else not knowing how the law works. So do you see how, curiously in their book, the Ramseys strongly imply that the grand jury didn't vote to indict them, taking a lead out of the district attorney's press conference, saying that there was insufficient evidence, or to use their words, in the eyes of the grand jury, there wasn't even a paltry amount of evidence to indict. Now, if you think about it, it's quite strange. So they listened to evidence for 13 months, and they didn't indict because there wasn't a lot of evidence. Okay. But if they did indict, does that mean there was a lot of evidence? Does that mean there was enough evidence, or not a lot, but enough, or more than enough? What does it actually mean? And I personally find it fascinating, the pageantry around what actually happened with the grand jury trial. There's this sort of narrative pageantry where you are told a certain story, but it's a little bit different from what actually happened. And of course, there's this assumption that you're not going to find out ultimately because someone is holding the cards that you can't see. But bear in mind their book, written between the grand jury decision in October 1999 and March 2000, that is pretty quick turnaround to bring out a book like this. And March 2000 is when they appeared on Larry King to promote their book, while it describes the notion that the grand jury voted to indict but the DA refused to go along with it as pure folly. And what does John Ramsey say in that CNN interview? He says, it's absurd, and he laughs. Now let's go to the Denver Post, dated March 15, 2000. The 13-month grand jury probe into her death ended October 13, 1999, without anyone being indicted. At the time, some reports suggested it was Smith's testimony that swayed the jurors. Wonder where that information came from. I wonder who started spreading those rumors. And were those rumors true? Or how about this from the Boulder Daily Camera in May 2001? A former attorney for Patsy Ramsey says he has heard that a majority on Boulder County's 1999 grand jury agreed not to indict anyone in the death of JonBenet Ramsey. The rumors that I have heard, and they are just rumors, were that they took a straw poll of the grand jurors and said there was not going to be an indictment, and the case then was closed in terms of the grand jury. And that's according to Boulder attorney Patrick Burke, what he told a group of attorneys gathered for a seminar Friday at the Adams Mark Hotel. And one wonders whether he said that informally, which then led to a rumor.
This is rumor control. Here are the facts.
For a secret process, there's a surprising amount we actually know about this Boulder grand jury. We know all of their names, we've seen some of their faces in this footage, but listen to this. The DA's involvement in this case was inappropriate. They interfered in the investigation by being roadblocks to getting things done. The DA's office did not want to do a grand jury until forced to. These are the words of Police Chief Mark Beckner. Also, former Denver prosecutor Craig Silverman said that Hunter bent over backwards to present both sides to the grand jury, an unusual step for the prosecutor in a murder investigation. Hold on, I'm a little bit confused now. I thought that it's all one-sided. We heard that from Paula Woodward. We've heard that from John. So what is actually going on here? Did they actually present both sides? Did they present one side or both sides? Officials involved in the proceedings repeatedly described it as an investigative grand jury, which is a special kind of grand jury, meaning that it did not confine its investigations to the theory presented to them only by the prosecution. Sorry, I'm a little bit confused. What did John say about it's not an investigative jury?
And that's the whole objective of a grand jury. It's not really an investigative jury.
So it's not an investigative jury, but it is. I mean, officials said that it was. So this is, in my opinion, one of the most glaring falsities presented on Netflix, at least as I understand it. And I think it relies on ignorance and the opacity surrounding the secrecy of these types of legal proceedings. But let's go on. Witnesses known to have testified include, and here we're going to put in bold and in red the Ramsey defense witnesses from this list. Did you know that Burke Ramsey testified, the Ramsey's pilot Mark Archuleta, the Ramsey's pediatrician Dr. Francisco Buff? Now the reason why I've identified him as likely sympathetic to the Ramseys is because we've seen him in documentaries doing exactly that, and his wife doing the same thing. The coroner John Mayer, just based on my understanding, has also been sympathetic to the Ramseys. The Ramsey defense advocate John Douglas, that is a big one. You know, allowing this guy, a profiler, to testify not just the big gun of Lou Smith, but another big gun in John Douglas, that's huge. And so why don't we examine an excerpt from John Douglas talking about his grand jury testimony in his book Law and Disorder. On September 15, 1998, closing in on 2 years after the murder, a grand jury of 4 women and 8 men began work. Hunter appointed attorney Michael Caine to head its investigation. By that time, Detective Steve Thomas had submitted his resignation, citing disagreements with the police. It's quite strange language that. Detective Steve Thomas submitted his resignation citing disagreements with the police over how the investigation was being handled. Is that accurate? We've just dealt with his letter. Is that what he said, what he felt, what was going on? And with the district attorney's office for having failed thus far to indict the Ramseys. Anyway, this is the pertinent part. Lou Smith and I both testified before the grand jury, and we were among the last witnesses. He went before the panel on March 11, 1999. My own testimony was heard on April 26th and 27th. Wow, so that is 2 days. Criminal profiler and Team Ramsey employee John Douglas testified in front of the grand jury. Smith had requested that he be allowed to testify, but his participation was rebuffed by the prosecutor, Michael Caine. And what happened at the end of the day? Well, he did testify. And I think this is the pertinent part, and this is the part no one ever talks about. Lou Smith testified, John Douglas testified, and the grand jury disagreed with both of them. Now let's go through some of the remaining witnesses. CBI forensics expert Debbie Chavez, CBI fingerprints expert George Herrera. How many of these names do you recognize? Ramsey family friends John and Barbara Fernie, Pam Griffin, Fleet and Priscilla White, Ramsey's housekeeper Linda Hoffman Pugh, and her husband Merv Pugh, Reverend Roll Hoverstock, Burke Ramsey's third grade teacher Carol Pirto. That's an interesting one. Handwriting expert Chet Hubowski, as well as at least 2 handwriting experts hired by the Ramsey defense team. And so by inference, what does this tell you about the grand jury and the handwriting aspect? Do you think the grand jurors thought the ransom note was written by an intruder or by one of the Ramseys, specifically one of the Ramseys? And then there were police officers Linda Arndt, Michael Everett, Rick French, Ron Gossage, Jane Harmer, Larry Mason, Fred Patterson, Tom Trujillo, Barry Weiss, and Tom Wickman, but not Detective Steve Thomas. Now, apparently the housekeeper, Linda Hoffman Pugh, who testified before the grand jury, told the Denver Post that during her interactions with them, quote, the grand jury focused almost exclusively on Patsy Ramsey. It's quite interesting, right? That's in terms of her testimony. It was almost all about Patsy, down to the underwear she had purchased from Bloomingdale's. She also said they wanted to know how she related to JonBenet. I felt in my heart they were going to indict Patsy. And in a way, the housekeeper was right. There are also a couple of names missing from this list. I think one of them is Doug Stein, Burke Ramsey's best friend. And didn't Susan Stein testify as well? As well as Susan's husband, Glenn. And it's hard to imagine that they weren't sympathetic to the Ramseys. Also, Fleet White III, Burke Ramsey's friend, also testified. It's unclear whether Ellis Armistead testified. There's a little bit of intrigue that he went in there and then came out a different door, and then the district attorney followed him a couple of minutes later. But if he did, that would be 3 Ramsey investigators. Now, not factual but rumored was the notion that Hunter discussed the decision not to file charges on several occasions before the jury completed its deliberations. And this is from the Ramsey Grand Jury Wiki, and so it should be treated with care. I'll put a link to that in the description. From the same source, another feature that made the grand jury unusual was that District Attorney Hunter allowed several witnesses for the defense, such as Lou Smith and the Ramsey's handwriting analysts, to testify. Well, who do you think the grand jury believed in that case? As well as this, and it's also from the same wiki, which, disclaimer, I've been unable to verify in terms of the exact terms that this was expressed in. Other than that, Governor Romer denied he wanted to replace Hunter with a special prosecutor. Listen to this. Governor Roy Romer, backed by a panel of Colorado district attorneys, informed Alex Hunter that he would be replaced by a special prosecutor if he did not replace his existing Ramsey case attorneys, hire new, more experienced prosecutors, and convene a grand jury. Well, did he consider that? Well, we do know that John's former pal Fleet White wrote to Governor Romer urging him to replace Hunter with a special prosecutor. And Lord knows, wanting to get Hunter off the roadblocked Ramsey case was a sentiment shared by many at the time. On Reddit, I've seen speculation along these lines. Alex Hunter acted to save his job. Is that true, I wonder? removing the two attorneys in charge of the Ramsey case, Peter Hofstrom and Trip DeMuth, and convened a grand jury conducted by Mike Cain. As I'm sure you can appreciate, this is all part of a much longer, more intricate and quite intriguing narrative, but I'm sure you'll agree the narrative around this, just a grand jury thing, is as bananas as the Ramsey ransom note. If you'd like me to share the 7 main thrusts, the 7 pieces of evidence that formed the bulk of the grand jury investigation and of the case presented to the grand jury, please let me know in the comments. I'm not going to take it further than that, but I do want to conclude by dealing with a timeline and one additional thing. You can see the fact that the grand jury trial started in September 1998 and concluded in October 1999. That's 13 months. That indicates it wasn't just the prosecution presenting their case in some one-sided way. As this myth has been perpetuated over and over and over again, it's simply not true. And so rest assured, no unassuming ham sandwiches were harmed or impinged during the grand jury trial. And so I can't help asking, are we being gaslighted by Netflix in terms of the show? As I noted in a previous analysis, the grand jury investigation only received the green light because the governor twisted the district attorney's arm. Netflix implies that this was improper, when the reality is it was highly unusual and more than a little unscrupulous of the DA's office to even be at this point so far into a case to begin with. If you listen to my reading of Detective Steve Thomas's 7-page, 3,000-word resignation letter with close to 30 references to the DA's office, and thank you if you did listen, and especially if you did listen all the way through, because if you care about true justice, it requires stamina and commitment and discipline and the ability to concentrate and stick with the thing. But above all, it requires the quality of caring, right? Well, then you do get a sense of the scale and scope of the impropriety, the bananas we're dealing with here. I hope you found the rumor control in this analysis enlightening. We'll deal with the merits of the grand jury trial in the next episode. And if you like, we can go into further detail about how Mike Cain felt, how he reacted to Hunter shutting down his insufficient evidence case. We should also look into Boulder Police Chief Mark Beckner's assessment of the case at that time. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.